religion as well.
Well, who was right? Who gets into heaven?
I'm afraid it was the Mormons. Yes, the Mormons were the correct.
I hope you all enjoyed that bit from South Park, and I would like to introduce the title of my video and presentation, which is called A Revelation Shrouded in Confusion. I must add that this title may seem a bit misleading. I do not intend by my chosen title to suggest that the commandment itself is confusing. It is rather simple, in fact. I solely wish to convey the history of and how interpretation and practice of this revelation changed over time. My presentation unit of study and major concept is Unit 8, Kirtland Revelations and the Word of Wisdom. And so this type of doctrine for the Word of Wisdom would be a policy doctrine. And so to link this to one of my related scholarly articles, which comes from Professor Sweat, Michael Hubbard McKay, and Garrett J. Dirkmatt, which is titled Doctrine, Models to Evaluate Types and Sources of Latter-day Saint Teachings, I quote, "Policy doctrine exists because God reveals different behavioral applications and policies to his children based on their temporal circumstances. The Word of Wisdom is a modern example of policy doctrine. Restrictions on tea and coffee and wine have not been in effect in all dispensations, yet because the Lord foresaw evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days, he provided a new doctrine for the benefit of the saints. This doctrine, in particular, has taken many shifts in policy, and eventually, by 1933, the Church Handbook of Instruction required members to strictly follow the Word of Wisdom to be able to enter into the temple." Wait, did that just say that the Church did not always require members to strictly follow the Word of Wisdom to be able to enter into the temple? To answer that question, I now cite my second scholarly article, which comes from Robert J. McHugh and is titled, "Did the Word of Wisdom Become a Commandment in 1851? The answer to that question is no. And to quote Robert J. McHugh, in the 19th century, the use of tea or coffee or tobacco or alcohol did not disqualify a member of the church from holding office or entering the temple, as is now the case. For example, to again quote Mr. McHugh in his scholarly article, Joseph Smith demonstrated by words and action that his personal approach was one of moderation rather than abstinence. For example, prior to his martyrdom at Carthage jail, Joseph Hyrum, Willard Richards, and John Taylor drank wine. Although not a direct quote from the prophet Joseph Smith himself, the Joseph Smith papers do say that although observance of the word of wisdom was not generally viewed as a standard of worthiness, non-observance sometimes resulted in church discipline. Furthermore, in the latter years of this decade following the martyrdom of Joseph Smith, to quote Mr. McHugh again, this was a time of further relaxation of any practical prescription implied in the Mormon Health Code, and Mormon pioneers who could afford it included tea, coffee, and alcohol among the staples they carried west. By 1851, adherence to the word of wisdom had been eroded even further by frontier conditions, and compliance may have well been at its 19th century nadir. To quote the Unit 8 section titled The Word of Wisdom, when the saints settled in the Great Basin, President Brigham Young asked in 1851 for the sustaining vote of the saints to obey the Word of Wisdom. However, it was still viewed as optional by many. President Brigham Young himself did not give up tobacco use until about 1860. Okay, so it has been established that in the early days of the church, the saints from Kirtland to the Salt Lake Valley did not adhere to the principles of the Word of Wisdom strictly. So when did the Word of Wisdom become an actual commandment for church members? To again quote the Unit 8 section titled The Word of Wisdom, it took a long time and was not firmly established until the presidency of Heber J. Grant during the Prohibition years of the 1920s. By President Grant's death in 1945, it had become accepted as a standard practice for faithful saints about 100 years after it was first revealed. Today, the Word of Wisdom can be understood by an acronym that I used in the Philippines as a missionary to help other people understand the Word of Wisdom. The acronym is SAKIT, which means sickness or pain. The S stands for cigarillo, which means cigarettes. The A, alak, which is alcohol. The K, kape, which is coffee. The I, ipinagbabawal ng mga droga, which is illegal drugs. And the T is cha, which is tea. It is generally understood that these 5 things are to be abstained at all times by church members and those who desire to enter into the temple worthily. To quote Boyd K. Packer on this matter, he said in his talk titled The Word of Wisdom, the Principle and the Promises, which was given at General Conference in April of 1996, that, I quote, "Everything harmful is not specifically listed. Arsenic, for instance, certainly bad, but not habit-forming. He who must be commanded in all things, the Lord said, is a slothful and not a wise servant." In some cultures, native drinks are claimed to be harmless because they are not specifically mentioned in the revelation, yet they draw members, particularly men, away from their families to parties which certainly offend the principle. Promises made in the revelation will be nigh to the careless or the reckless. Latter-day Saints today understand that obedience to these principles yields blessings. And I would now like to quote my two D and C verses, which come from section 89, you guessed it, of the Doctrine and Covenants. Verses 18 and 19 say that all saints who remember to keep and do these sayings, walking in obedience to the commandments, shall receive health in their navel and marrow to their bones, and shall find wisdom and great treasures of knowledge and even hidden treasures, and shall run and not be weary, and shall walk and not faint. In order to highlight some of the blessings that come from adherence to the Word of Wisdom, President Thomas S. Monson at the October 2016 General Conference gave a talk titled Principles and Promises, where a young soldier in the Philippines who was a Latter-day Saint received strength to climb a rope during the middle of a battle and save his life. I am quickly running out of time on the video, and I would like to wrap up with my two key concepts and my one key takeaway. And the first is that Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and the early church's attitude towards the Word of Wisdom was one of moderation rather than abstinence. And concept two is that the revelation was not included as a binding commandment and a standard for temple worthiness until around the death of President Heber J. Grant. And my one key takeaway is that although not established until the 1940s as a binding commandment, the Word of Wisdom promises us physical as well as spiritual blessings as outlined in Doctrine and Covenants section 89 for faithful Latter-day Saints.